I think a good way to measure the cultural impact of an artist is to think about how well known they are to children. I mean, the Beatles, John Lennon said it himself, the band's more popular than Jesus. Roald Dahl, come on, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was required reading for me in first grade. And speaking of reading, I did a lot of that as a kid. And I spent the better part of 6, 7 years obsessed with Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. All this is to say, I was very well acquainted with all manner of different artists as a child, despite the fact that I grew up in Singapore, a foreign country to the vast majority of them. And I think that just goes to illustrate the extent of the cultural reach of these artists. But the thing about all that impact is impact tends to come with a lot of influence. And artists, especially, are in a pretty unique position where they pretty much make their living off of expressing themselves as people and having other people pay attention to it and take notes. So if they turn out to not be such great people themselves, that can have tangible consequences. I mean, think J.K. Rowling using her platform to spread transphobia, or Kanye West preaching Nazism, or Roald Dahl being anti-Semitic, or John Lennon abusing women, or Pablo Picasso abusing women, or Eric Clapton being a racist, or Kevin Spacey being a pedophile. Actually, no. We don't want to hear Hey Jude in one ear and have an annoying voice in the other one saying, oh, but this man beat his wife. No, we don't want to think about that sort of thing, do we? It's just too much beyond a point. And that point is where we introduce the concept of separating art from the artist. Forget the person who made it. Focus on just the art. When we separate art from the artist, we essentially choose to focus solely on the artist's work and ignore who they are as a person, choosing instead to think of them as a figure defined by their contributions to culture and our lives rather than as an actual human being. And that doesn't feel like something with much impact, does it? I mean, the neo-Nazi Kanye West has 16 million monthly listeners on Spotify. So what's one more, right? What does it matter if you just stream Graduation a couple of times? How do we even define supporting an artist? Well, some people would say it's an ideological thing, as in you have to be anti-Semitic to support Kanye West, or you have to beat women to support John Lennon, which at least to me is a little bit of a cop-out, because I personally don't think it's that difficult to say, I don't support that guy because I am not a Nazi, even though objectively speaking, you are in fact supporting him, financially at least. And that's what the other camp would argue, that regardless of your moral standing on the artist, to consume their work is to support them, period. So where do we draw the line? I mean, at what point can we definitively draw a line in the sand and say, hey, this is okay, but this isn't? Is it even possible to do something like that to begin with? If it is, that would certainly make things a lot easier. But the morality of things like this is pretty murky, especially because it's so hard for us to envision the consequences. And that brings me to the continuum paradox. So the continuum paradox is a mathematical inquiry that concerns itself with the nature of infinities and their relationship with finite quantities. And my take on the continuum paradox sort of zeroes in on a certain aspect of it, which is the idea that an infinity, a system so vast and seemingly all-encompassing, is really just made up of small, tiny, infinitesimal little parts that all accumulate to get from, say, point A to point B. And those parts may not seem like much when you take them in isolation, and it's certainly hard to gauge the part they have to play in the grand scheme of things. But everything adds up, as it were. Everything and everyone has their own part to play, which in my opinion is an idea sorely missing from the collective consciousness these days. I mean, it's just one straw. I said 8 billion people, right? So the continuum paradox essentially tells us that we don't really have a great handle on the small-term effects of the idea of one single individual's impact, and requires a bit of faith to internalize something like that. But faith, especially when paired with ignorance in a context like this, can be very easily manipulated. Which brings me to the Nazis. One Nazi in particular, Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann. Now, you may not have heard of Eichmann, but he was also a massively influential individual. You see, in 1942, Eichmann was an attendee of an event called the Wannsee Conference, which was essentially this top secret meeting for a bunch of very high-ranking Nazis to get together and plan the exact logistical details of what we now know as the Holocaust. So, as you might imagine, what with not only being a pretty high-ranking Nazi, but also one of the key architects of the systematic slaughter of the Jews, Eichmann landed himself in a little bit of trouble after the war. He was captured by the Allies and actually managed to escape to Argentina, where he hid out for 10 years until he was captured by Mossad and taken to Israel in 1960. 1 year later, he was put on trial in Jerusalem, and the trial, which lasted for very long, eventually culminated in his execution. Now, Eichmann's trial attracted a lot of attention and publicity and a massive audience, both internationally through television and right there with people sitting in the courts watching it all unfold. And one of those people was another very influential individual, a German philosopher named Hannah Arendt, whose relevance to this whole affair primarily stems from the fact that she actually wrote a book about the whole thing. And she titled it Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Banality, as in banal, which means boring. And that sounds a bit counterintuitive when we think about our understanding of evil, doesn't it? I mean, we think of evil as being this larger than life overarching concept, don't we? Boring would be the last word we use to describe it. We think of it as being flashy and easy to spot. But Hannah Arendt's concept of evil was a little bit different. You see, Hannah Arendt's idea of evil was that it's a systematic process that is not flashy or easy to spot whatsoever, and that it relies on the input of many disparate people, humans, all acting on one subconscious principle, which she called the root of evil: thoughtlessness. You see, in Eichmann's trial, he used a defense that many of his Nazi compatriots also turned to: the idea that he was just following orders without regard for their wider reach. And his role in the Holocaust was to coordinate the deportations of Jews to the ghettos and concentration camps. And his defense was that he simply moved trains without regard for, what was actually on the trains, because he was just doing his job. And so the thing that stuck out to Arendt the most over this entire trial was how normal of a person Eichmann really appeared to be. She described him as not even sinister and quite ordinary and commonplace. But hold on, this is a guy who we now know as the architect of the Holocaust. So this isn't how we really refer to someone like that at all. We think of someone like that almost like a caricature. And the absence of an ability to write such an actor off as insane or inhuman, the fact that we're forced to reckon with the possibility that people with that potential could be all around us, that we could be those people, is genuinely terrifying. Eichmann and Arendt were really just playing the role of the messenger here. The real horror of the banality of evil is how normal it appears to be until it's too late. But how do normal people like you and me and everyone we know wind up in positions like Eichmann's and retain their normalcy? I mean, surely they would have to be changed to some extent by the knowledge of their actions and their scale of impact, right? Well, yes, obviously. But sometimes no. Because it turns out all you need to get someone to perform an abhorrent act willingly is take away their perspective. And it's this point that we may be asking ourselves a rather weighty question: how did we get here? And I'm not asking how humanity got to this point or anything like that. I mean, how did I get here from the beginning of my speech? I started off by talking about the ethics of separating art from the artist. So why am I telling you about the trial of a Nazi in the 1960s? Well, it turns out that though the banality of evil and separating art from the artist may seem like unrelated concepts, they have their roots in the same fundamental idea. But what is that? Well, the answer to that question is a long one. But it begins with the idea of complicity. The idea that we can be responsible for the fallout of a system due to our own actions, despite the fact that we may not have even wanted to contribute to it in the first place. In the case of separating art from the artist, like I said earlier, we are complicit in the artist's continued survival in their profession by continuing to consume their work, even if we don't stand in moral agreement with their actions. The banality of evil similarly tells us that even if we don't want to or don't realize it, we can prop up malignant systems or regimes through our actions. But there's more than meets the eye here. There's room for us to go a little bit deeper. What more do these two similarities have in common? Well, it's one of the first things I actually led with, and it's something that just resurfaced not too long ago. We often justify separating art from the artist because we really only have a handle on the short-term effects of our own actions, and aren't very good at considering the big picture accumulation of many people also doing the same thing. And if we think about that effect in the context of the banality of evil, it becomes very clear that the way the Nazi system was set up served them incredibly well, in that every individual contribution was kept separate from the others, isolated, to prevent any given participant from seeing the big picture. And what I mean by that is, for instance, it may feel a little bit weighty to take a train of Jews to a concentration camp, but it maybe doesn't feel so bad if all you have on your conscience is just holding a door, or driving a train, or watching over the whole thing. And it doesn't feel so bad to just stream a song, especially if you know you're not the only one. And that's the real common thread here: a lack of perspective. But there's room to go a little bit further here. We can still go deeper. Because that lack of perspective isn't just a blindness to the big picture. It's not just forcing complicity by isolating individuals from one another. It's isolating them from the concept of an individual to begin with. And that is what I think lies at the root of this whole thing. A little phenomenon that I like to refer to as obfuscating the individual. So what does that mean? Well, obfuscating or obfuscation is defined as the action of making something obscure, unclear, or unintelligible. And isn't that what we've been talking about this entire time? We also like to use the word dehumanization in some context to describe this effect, but I think it's a lot more interesting to specifically consider how the idea of the individual has been impacted. Remember at the beginning of this speech when I said that we tend to form a distinction between figures and people? Well, that's essentially what this whole thing boils down to. When we separate art from the artist, we're choosing to disregard an artist as a human. And think about this. We're just creating degrees of separation between us and them. Another way this sort of manifests is, have you ever been in an argument with someone over the phone or when texting them and have your animosity and anger just melt away upon seeing them in person? Seeing someone, calling them, texting them, their body, their voice, their words. They're all layers, layers of the other person's humanity, or at least what we get to see of it. And as we descend further and further down that ladder, as we remove more and more of those layers, we're stripping away the perceptible humanity of the other person step by step. And this is something especially easy to do to someone who you don't know on a personal level, as I imagine would be the case for most of the people engaged in the whole art versus artist debacle. It's very easy to forget that someone else is a human, especially when you have the ability to reduce them to a number or their words or a label or a voice or something like that. It's also very easy to forgive someone when you take into account that they are a human, but it's not always so easy to keep that consideration in mind. We're more inclined to just focus on art and not focus on its creator. But why? It's because human beings are inherently very complicated. And associating anything to them, like a movie or a book or a TV show or a painting or a sculpture, is inconvenient and very difficult because the scales just don't match. In a similar vein, it's hard to associate large-scale actions to individual actors. For instance, the case of the Nazis that I just spent a lot of time describing earlier, but also in our daily lives. Hannah Arendt herself named thoughtlessness as the root of evil, and critically reckoning with the effects of our own actions is genuinely very difficult, especially if doing so might force us to accept that we may be the ones in the wrong. And that's what I think is so interesting about the obfuscation of the individual, that we try to pick and choose when and when not to do it at our convenience. We choose to ignore the humanity of an artist when we're inconvenienced by them being a problematic person. And similarly, people in the Nazi regime found it very convenient to put down or belittle Jews because they weren't talking about any specific Jew, they were making a generalization and stripping away the humanity of all those who fell under it by refusing to think of them as anything more than a label. And the ethnic cleansing, targeted violence, and unprovoked genocide of yesterday hasn't gone anywhere. It's still all around us, and dehumanization remains its chief enabler. But the most ironic thing in all of this is where we seem to have forgotten about the world. The irony in us choosing to dehumanize all these people, all these individuals whose humanity we've ignored, is that in the process we've somehow dehumanized ourselves. The continuing paradox tells us that even though our own impact seems a world away, everyone truly has their own part to play. And for us to forget that and roll over would truly be our greatest failure. It can feel like the distance between the power of one and the powers of many has become an abyss. And we can respond to that in one of two ways. One, we can say, this thing is only a problem because a lot of people support it, and there's nothing that I can do about that. And I don't think that that's a necessarily invalid thing to say. Like I said earlier, the nature of democracy is that the many take priority over the few. And it is genuinely very difficult to rally enough people to make even a small dent in, say, a 60 million person figure. And those 60 million people separate art from the artist. Wouldn't they all be apathetic? In that crowd, nobody's listening, right? But here's the thing. That's another generalization. And I'd bet that for most of those people separating art from the artist and supporting this problematic person, that apathy that they feel isn't just apathy to the problems of the artist. In fact, for most of them, that isn't even the case at all. Most people are not immoral. Most people aren't apathetic, really. They're only apathetic to the notion that change is even possible to begin with, because they've all fallen for the fallacy that I've taken up so much of your time in describing. And so at last, the second option, the second possible response to this problem that's been plaguing us, is to reject that notion and say, it does not matter how many people it takes to effect change, because I have friends everywhere. I have friends everywhere. And so do you, even if you don't realize it. Remember this. Try. We need to take matters into our own hands and take a single step forward into the future.